Mashery. Don't be a SOA-saurus. Learn how to enable your business with API management. Today we've got two speakers. We've got one special guest speaker, Eve Mailer, a principal analyst from Forrester, and our very own Chris Lippi, VP of Products at Mashery. Again, I'm Bonnie, and I'm helping to run the webinar today. I've got a couple housekeeping things to go over with you guys first. Everyone's phone line should be on mute, but if you want to ask questions or if you have any connectivity issues or you can't hear us, feel free to use the chat function within the GoToWebinar panel or the questions function. You can just type in there and we can see it. We are recording this webinar, and everyone will get a copy of the recording after we close up the session. So we'll get started first, and we'll get started first with Eve presenting. Go ahead, Eve.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can see my screen momentarily. I'm Eve Mailer, and I am a principal analyst with Forrester Research, and I serve security and risk professionals. And the focus area of my research is identity and access management. That includes web services and API security, authentication, consumer-facing identity. But it may be more interesting or relevant for you to know some of my background. I was actually the first chair of the SAML standards effort, and for a number of years I ran the Sun and Microsoft Web Services and Identity Interop program. Another way to know me is just that on Twitter I'm XML Girl, but I'll let you in on a little secret. I'm also Lady JSON. So we're here to talk today about not being a, quote, SOA-saurus, and that's not to be depressing as a thought. It's really meant to talk about how web services and service-oriented architecture are actually evolving and how we need to evolve along with what we're seeing in business so that we can become indispensable to business owners when we're in IT. And related to this topic that we're discussing today, Forrester happened just yesterday to publish a wave that looks at vendors in the API management platform space. So keep an eye out for that, which takes a deep dive look at this market. So how I want to proceed this morning is just to talk first about the problem space and how essentially nobody's an unextended enterprise anymore, and how the real story is how we get better at being cross-domain. So you may very well be the master of your IT domain, but that's not the whole story anymore. And secondly, I'll talk a little bit about Forrester's information security model that we call Zero Trust and how it maps to the proposition of doing API management, cross-domain connections between companies and individuals in a secure fashion. And finally, I just want to conclude, before I turn things back over to Chris, by offering some concrete recommendations on how we can get started with this. So let's talk a little bit about the pressures that IT security is under today. A couple of the main pressures are actually very IT-driven. It's IT's primary responsibility to look after things like the cybersecurity threats that we now face, the notion of continuous protection, even in the middle of, say, a user's login session. And then when it comes to how IT is done, folks in IT have the responsibility to take a look at new, for example, cloud and virtualization ways of performing IT functions. In fact, we published a Forrester wave on cloud IAM just to prove the point not too long ago. These options are really changing. So those are proactive things that you can do. How is the business affecting IT? And there's a lot of interesting things going on. One proposition is that we have this extended enterprise notion that cross-domain is the story of how we do business. You have to connect with the outside, to the outside, accept connections from the outside. It's a reality. And then the other pressure that the business is driving is this notion of the API economy, where we're exposing sensitive resources to new channels, and often that's actually mobility driven. So I like to describe the challenge of the extended enterprise in 3 dimensions. The first dimension of interest is that the apps that we use that manage our sensitive corporate resources are no longer exclusively under our control in our domain. We might be contracting with a third party to use some sort of SaaS application to have a very deep role in managing those sensitive resources. A second dimension is that the channels through which we have people accessing those applications and the sensitive data tend to be unmanaged more often than not now, whether it's networks or devices that are entirely unmanaged. So that starts to take things out of our control. And then the third dimension, and this isn't actually new, but it's something that gains more importance in the modern era, is that the user populations of these applications and the sensitive resources, they're not just employees. There's a whole range. There's actually a lot of hybrid use cases, for example, in higher education, where students, well, they're not customers, they're not employees, they have multiple affiliations perhaps with different research universities. So we've got a lot of circumstances under which the primary kind of manager of somebody's identity is not you, and yet they're accessing your information. So the question becomes, if you've got, say, a partner accessing sensitive data of yours through unmanaged networks and devices, and the sensitive data is hosted not even with you, but by a third party, if they never touch home base, how do you actually control access? How do you audit access? And the reality is, there's the unextended enterprise in that square, in that cube, and nobody's an unextended enterprise anymore. We really have a problem space that looks that big, and every point in that larger cube is actually a different problem space unless we choose to manage it in a consistent, universal fashion. So what's the takeaway of this? What does this all mean? Well, tight security couple strains IT's ability to scale to new business opportunities. I've had people tell me, well, look, I can't get my head around this. I can't just Kerberize apps anymore. They're not my apps. So that's just an example of the problems that we face. Now, in the meantime, when we're worried about managing access by partners, say, to extranet applications and services, the modern open web API has become a thing. They've become new channels for direct revenue. They have business models and they have product managers. And so this is just, I know it's a bit of an eye chart, but I wanted to show it because John Musser, who runs programmableweb.com, has started to put together a kind of map for his own purposes, kind of a mind map or something of the business models behind the APIs that he knows about. And I might take issue with Facebook being the only one that's just free and doesn't have a business model, but it's interesting to see that it sort of comes from every walk of life. It includes financials, it includes geolocation features, it includes e-commerce, of course it includes social. It's now everything. So in a world like that, we have attention. And there was this wonderful rant that was published, it was now a little over a year ago actually. Steve Yegge, who is currently a Google engineer, was an Amazon engineer, and in a wonderful display of irony, he published a rant on Google Plus that he did not intend for the world to see, but he got the access controls wrong and the world saw it, and luckily Google didn't fire him, but this is part of how the rant went. One of the things he observed that Amazon does well that he thought Google should do better is the mandate that was imposed that all teams will henceforth expose their data and functionality through service interfaces, which enables Amazon to do more business. Basically, at the margin, you can have market clearing of all the functionality that you're exposing that's valuable. There's a problem, though. Accessibility of this sort to value has an evil twin named security. How do you put value on the edge and then feel that you're secure in exposing that only to those who need it? And as he observed, people who are in charge of IT security have a tough row to hoe, because you can say security is important, but oftentimes the top line is driving decisions more than the bottom line. The business upside is being paid more attention to than the security downside. And the way he put it so memorably was that, dialing accessibility to zero means you have no product at all. Whereas dialing security to zero can still get you a reasonably successful product, such as Sony PlayStation Network when they had their breach. So just to put a point on it, security has never been fully a driver of the requirements for deploying new features, new business features, but it's getting tougher now. And this is what that relationship change looks like. And yes, web devification, well, it's not a word. I don't know. I think I made up this word. But it's a cousin to consumerization of IT. The way it used to be was that IT security architects would sit there and line of business developers would come to them and say, can I do XYZ? And IT security had the sole right to say, yes, you can, or no, you can't, or change this. But now this relationship is more loosely coupled, even in the case of line of business developers, but certainly in the case of B2B partners who want to develop client applications to functionality that the company is exposing, but certainly in the case of long tail developers, it's much more peer-to-peer. The power relationship has literally evened up so that IT security architects are much more in a position of saying, okay, I'm going to make you jump through these hoops to get to this value. Are you willing to do it? And the folks on the other side are much more in a position to say, your needs are not my needs. You're making that too expensive for me. So in a nutshell, the business relationship around security mechanisms looks like this. The API might have value X, a lot of value. Twitter API, for example, has a lot of value. Any security mechanism you impose to control access to it imposes friction Y. Is Y less than X? Well, that's kind of the first requirement. It had better be a lot less than X. And just to tell a little bit of a story around this, Twitter is a really interesting example because you'd say near social, but obviously there's enough business behind it that Twitter has been closing ranks a little bit and actually closing up their API in a few ways in order to make sure that they can retain the value that they see is clearly there. Twitter unusually has imposed more security friction with its choice of API security and access control, despite newer, easier things being available, because it can get away with it, because the API is so valuable. So it's an illustration of the point. So, okay, we've got a problem, we have a challenge. We need to solve this challenge, which is not just not standing in the way of business, but actually enabling business. And so what I recommend to you is that think of API management as an extension of SOA into dramatically different domains, dramatically different partners who may not be like you at all. They may not be, say, a large enterprise. They might be a garage developer, and that's who you want to attract. And so you need a new security model that actually has the agility properties that you need. So in the Zero Trust information security model, we start with an assumption that all interfaces and all connections are untrusted. So it's inherently more of an opt-in approach than the opt-out approach we typically use. You can see the source here is from my colleague John Kinderbog, who wrote this No More Chewy Centers, Introducing the Zero Trust Model of Information Security. The crunchy shell and the chewy center, the firewall approach is no longer viable. So if you look at the back of a firewall appliance, you see 2 ports. And nominally, the trusted port goes to the internal network, and the untrusted port goes to the internet. Should you trust the trusted port? Of course, the answer is no, you should not trust the trusted port. Basically, that's a way of shortcutting security and pretending vulnerabilities don't exist. You have to really change your mindset in order to think this way, but one of the implications that it has is that you can apply this all the way up the network stack, and including identity and access management functions that can help you perform the kind of access control you need. So in order to achieve this for identity and access management functions, what we recommend is that you start to think of, people have talked about IDaaS, Identity as a Service, or IDMAAS, Identity Management as a Service. It turns out that that may lead you into thinking that is not responding to the API economy imperative. And so I like to say, think of it as IAM as an API. What do I mean by that? Well, in the classic API facade pattern, which we now apply to open web APIs and facades to all kinds of corporate value, whether or not they are based initially on, say, RESTful APIs, or whether they're based on SOAP APIs or something platform specific, the API facade pattern simply means that you have whatever scale-out infrastructure you want on the back end, and you expose endpoints, those could be the little yellow dots, to your services. Those are your service interfaces, and they have definitions. And you can have any client write to them. And the exciting part about this today is you can have native mobile apps write to them, you can have web service clients write to them, you can have browser-based web apps write to them. It all can just work. And the dirty little secret of what we call APIs today, the cool name for it is API. From my perspective, they're really just request response protocols that are platform independent, which is a great thing. So if you apply that thinking to identity and access management, what does it look like? Well, it looks identical, in fact. What it means is that anybody who is the sole authoritative source for identity information about a person or an application or whatever it is that has an identity basically offers an identity server with endpoints that get engaged and who can write those client applications that access, say, the authentication service endpoint. Well, it can actually be anybody, and it can be third parties, and it can be long tail third parties if you want them to be. So in fact, we're just kind of recursively applying to identity and access management for API management exactly what we do for business APIs, business function APIs. So a couple of implications about this. Number one, okay, you're now exposing interfaces for crown jewels for IT as well as for business functions. So yes, you must robustly protect them, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And there's another thing, another question that often comes up when we talk about this. Well, APIs can't do fine-grained authorization the way that my legacy homegrown apps do fine-grained authorization. And the way I would respond to that is to say, it all depends on how you design the interface. You can actually design in fine-grained control if you wish, but it's a choice you have to make in that API, taking into consideration the audience. So, okay, so we have this new paradigm. We have new emerging identity technologies and solutions. And yes, they disrupt. They're disruptive. They're not how we've done them before, but they attract. Or, as Douglas Crockford, who invented JSON, put it, the good thing about reinventing the wheel is that you can get around one. And I will tell you, I'm a big Douglas Crockford and JSON fangirl. And even though I helped invent XML, I went up to him at a conference a few years ago and waxed poetic about how wonderful I thought his work was. And as soon as he heard that I helped create XML, he went off on a rant that was clearly the reason why he invented this little phrase. So there you go, comeuppance for me. So what are these new emerging technologies? The first key one that we have to look at is OAuth. And I've got this picture here, which is kind of OAuth in a pictorial nutshell, but I want to spend a moment talking about how people today are securing web services. They are using WS security in some cases, but Forrester's research, its ability to do surveys across IT security populations, shows that it pretty much peaked at 30% of people doing web services that need any kind of security. And part of the reason is because you might not have the use case that requires end-to-end protection of the WS security sort. But it's my belief that what the numbers show is that among the 80% of folks who use SOAP, only 20, 25, 30% might be using WS security. It's because there's pent-up demand for a security solution that imposes less friction. Other things people use, HTTP basic, very simple, very easy to do, not particularly secure, and certainly not friendly when it comes to trying to brand an experience where you'd have a flow where you want to redirect somebody to, say, login and consent. Mutual SSL, used very frequently in the web services world, certainly for extranet web services. It works really well, but it requires a lot of careful static onboarding. So those are some of the options that we've had to date. OAuth is a new option that actually reduces the friction while in the main providing the same kind of security that you'd expect with the older technologies. So I want to show just a couple of use cases for how people are using OAuth today, just to sort of, I guess, wet your whistle. You may have some of these same use cases. eBay is a really interesting case because they're using RESTful APIs extensively internally. They also want to create a third-party ecosystem for the APIs that they expose for doing seller tasks. If you're an eBay seller and you put a lot of things up for auction, they actually have channel partners, essentially third parties that create seller apps. And these apps, these seller apps may be web apps, they may be mobile apps, native apps. So you've got these parties in the picture. You've got an eBay seller who's already set up, an eBay account. They want to use one of the seller apps, and eBay is able to serve in the role of letting that seller app connect. So the third parties offer these apps. These third-party apps want to connect to the eBay API for selling on the seller's behalf. The great thing about the OAuth paradigm versus what we were doing previously, where we would collect the user's eBay username and password, is those third-party apps never actually see that. Instead of impersonating the seller, they get issued an access token, an OAuth access token, that represents the seller's permission for them to access the API and represents a tuple of the seller app and the user and eBay. What's cool is the app can now do stuff when the user's offline, sleeping, windsurfing, whatever, and maybe do push notifications as necessary. This is the power of this kind of access token model of delegated constrained access. Second use case, this is very much a B2B use case. Really interesting how this construction firm is letting its project partners actually kind of single sign in to a client app that then can make these API calls. So you've got a guy out in the field, a construction firm, it turns out, if you're building something like a dam, it's never done by one company alone. You have essentially like a joint venture with several co-competitors. And so let's say they've got a corporately issued tablet to which that employee actually authenticates every morning on an employee-employer basis. When they want to access the construction firm's APIs through this mobile app that's been crafted for the purpose of whatever it is they're doing literally out in the field, valve design, for example, they actually don't have the experience of having to log in and consent to the connection. Their company has done that for them. So people are using OAuth in this pattern to enable kind of single sign-in from the user's perspective, and then the API calls are made in the same way. So this is a case where we're actually mixing SAML authentication at the home base, SAML single sign-on into an OAuth flow. This last use case that I want to present to you is super interesting because it's starting to, in some cases, supplant classic low-level web services. This is known colloquially in the OAuth world as two-legged, meaning there's actually no user in the picture. There's no human being. It's just a low-level web service client app. It's a web service client that's accessing a web service provider all internally to eBay. This is something they do today, where you've got the same OAuth roles except no human being. The kinds of web service clients you find are, I need this HTML hunk to be checked. I need to verify this credit card number. I need to format the shipping label. It's the kind of thing where you may very well want to have chargebacks internally. You certainly want to have security because as far as eBay is concerned, they have to be prepared to go zero trust. Any endpoint may be exposed on the edge, accidentally or on purpose, at any time. So they've got to have these, quote, internal web services secured in a zero trust fashion, and they're actually doing this by having the coordination internally to issue OAuth tokens. And while I don't have time in this short webinar, unless there's questions at the end about why they chose to do this versus these other methods like BASIC, like mutual SSL, we can talk about that. What's interesting to know is that OAuth hasn't fully solved for the entire picture of the internal communication around their security token service. But in the main, people are inventing patterns to do this now, so I anticipate that being standardized shortly. So this is how zero trust API access control is starting to be done. Who's doing this API access control? Well, it's a team effort. So what you see here is actually, it's a diagram from this Forrester wave that I mentioned to you. It says forthcoming. In fact, it was published yesterday, so you can look for that on the web. What you see is that you've got API providers, and that dotted line, the vertical dotted line, is critical to the model here. You've got an API provider that is conceptually separate from the API consumer, client app developers and the companies they work for, even if it's the same company that's doing all of this. So for example, you might have an API owner who's an enterprise architect for internal APIs that are part of the application architecture and the enterprise architecture internally. And the developers who are making calls to those APIs are actually just line of business developers who come into work every day and they're salaried and they work for the same company. This conceptual separation is really key. This is how you get zero trust security. By contrast, you may very well have an API owner who's a product manager for an API that has a business model behind it. And then things look very different. It might be a trusted partner who is actually writing the client apps that call that API. It might be, again, native or web. Or it might be a situation where you're trying to attract a really big ecosystem like Twitter has done, like Facebook has done, like so many have done. And you're willing to have really anybody walk up and become a client app developer and register. So you can see in this picture that there's representation from people who own the business reason why the API exists. You've got people who are in charge of the back-end scale-out infrastructure and the operations, and you've got somebody who's developing the connection between the API and the back-end systems that actually contain the sensitive corporate data, the systems of record, if you will. So it's obviously a team effort. So some of the criteria that we actually included in this wave that we published were things like, how does an API management platform actually support security of APIs as well as the deep access control mechanisms? How is traffic throttled when it comes right down to it? What types of security mechanisms does it support? And what we see is that it really depends on the use cases being served. If it's primarily B2B use cases, you always see OAuth. I will tell you, that's baseline. That's the first rung of the API access control ladder. But in enterprise use cases, you might see things like WS security, for example, and some of the others I mentioned. If it's very much about public APIs that are meant to appeal to the long tail, it can be a different mix. Another thing you can look for, what sorts of policies does it support for controlling access? And these can reflect both security imperatives and the business model imperatives. How does it support how client app developers actually engage in getting access to the API with the different applications that they're developing? So these are the kinds of considerations that we looked at in doing the wave. And the space is not entirely new, but it's got a lot of new entrants, which is kind of interesting. So it's a very exciting time for API management as an evolution of SOA, really. So I want to just conclude here with just a couple of pieces of advice about how you can become indispensable to the business in looking after API management and the control needed around it. And the advice that I'm sharing actually is advice that we heard from actually customer references when we were doing this wave. We were talking to people who had implemented API management platforms, and we said, okay, what's your best advice for somebody else who's going into this? One of the things that we heard is that sometimes business folks don't even really think as far as API access control. They just think, ooh, new business, upside, uplift. They get excited about that, and they might not have come to the folks who know best how to do this. And in order to come to you, they need to know that you know your stuff. I had the experience of working with a company where they asked me to help them with a web single sign-on strategy. That's what they called it. And when we actually did the analysis, it turned out that they had a really sophisticated ecosystem of their own of what I would call runtime identity propagation, not just web and not just web single sign-on. And that included, hey, did you think about how you're going to let folks using client applications access the API that it sounds like you're planning to deploy sometime? And they said, oh, good point. We didn't think of that. We're going to go to the business and tell them we've got them covered based on what we've learned in this experience. So that's something that I hope will attract techies is, go and learn something new and play with it. I guess it can't be stated often enough. Another piece of advice that I would give you is the notion of security actually changes as your application architecture shifts. The notion of crunchy shell, chewy center is so last century, if it ever really applied at all. Defense in depth is always a good idea. It helps to know sort of how to go about that. This zero trust thinking actually really does help. In fact, I'm almost inclined to go and disagree with Steve Yegge at this juncture and say, you know, accessibility isn't a versus security thing, because the API management paradigm puts all the emphasis on endpoints that you choose to expose. It gives you the opportunity to have much more of an opt-in outlook around those endpoints that you choose to expose. Just as a simple example, at each endpoint, you can choose to not support all of the HTTP methods that are possible. Simple thing, but it's a very zero trust approach to have policy around checking for the unsupported HTTP methods. Finally, I had to put a dinosaur in here somewhere because of this wonderful word, SOA-saurus, which actually the Mashery folks had introduced me to. This is actually a picture of some little kid was playing around one day and put backpacks on all of his toys, and I found this wonderful picture. So let's use this to represent moving from the world of how we did things before to the world where bring your own device and mobility and client apps that you didn't write are becoming so important to business. You have to account for this in your API plans, and you can expect it to disrupt your old security paradigms. For example, it's not just web SSO anymore. So a couple of implications of this would be that if you've got classic web services that you're happy with internally as essentially your systems of record, you may very well want to wrap or translate them, put a shim on them specifically for mobile. And you also have to consider the tolerances of those folks who are your new client app developer audience. If those are your channel partners, for example, they're third parties with respect to you. They do not have the same imperatives that you do. They answer to a different boss. So you have to consider what they're willing to tolerate to get all the way over to your value that you're offering in your API. So with that, I will conclude. I listed my normal Twitter handle. I listed my Google Plus handle. You can also find me at Lady JSON. I wasn't kidding. And with that, I will turn matters back over to Chris.
Thanks so much, Eve. You know, I love that presentation. I love talking about how API management really is just an evolution of what we've all been working on for so long. And really, you know, what resonates for me as a guy who's been hooking systems together for a couple of decades. I love the idea of taking things that we've been doing and in many ways adapting it to really what's a major technology shift that's going on right now in the world of connected devices and mobility. And I think what we've all been studying and practicing for a couple of decades really has, you know, has become front and center with a lot of what our businesses need in order to take advantage of this great opportunity in front of us. So just a little bit about Mashery. You know, we're a VC-funded company based in San Francisco in Silicon Valley, founded in 2006, and really, you know, we came at this integration space really thinking about the business side of integration, and not so much about, you know, traditional web service technology companies that are about exposing and creation of APIs, but really around the business management and the business development opportunities that are exposed through API platforming and API products. You know, as we've grown and as the space in API management has, well, become a space, frankly, you know, the analysts have been following us, and we're happy to be included in Eve's WAVE report that was just released that she mentioned. The other analysts have been following us for a little while as well. So what do we do for a living? So what Mashery does is we help our customers manage their API platforms, and we do this for a variety of name brands and startups and small businesses. We work with companies that have very much B2B type needs, where it's working with partners is the most important thing, and, you know, may not be order to cash, or it might be order to cash kind of workflows. We work with people that are in media, name brand recognizable media organizations that are looking to expose their digital assets to new class of developers in the app economy, B2B, getting closer to partners, companies that Eve mentioned eBay, but lots of people in the retail space and travel space that are trying to broaden their reach into affiliate networks and do kind of grow revenue through partnerships. And people that are basically building brand new platforms to really affect consumers' lives. So lots of interesting work that we're doing with some pretty great companies. We do this for so many, and as a software as a service company, it results in over 55,000 apps and integration points that run through our network on a daily basis. And many of these apps are things that are sitting in your pocket today, or they're things that you'll never see the light of day, or you will never see because they're private between close trading partners. We do it for a lot of big companies. We also do it for small companies, but people you will recognize, new hot startups that get the idea of API as platform. So turning our attention back to the topic today, and really about APIs as an evolution. Really we all understand as technology folks that APIs are not new, and there's lots of different definitions about what APIs are. At the end of the day, this is new protocols, some new ways of thinking about APIs, but it's basically kind of teaching a dog new tricks, old dog new tricks. They're just being used in new places. So I'm an old enough guy, and I'm the dinosaur here on the left, right? I'm a guy who's been working on integrating systems for a long time. And this is actually a picture, predated me a little bit by a couple of years, but this is a picture of a company that had built a client-side EDI product that they were taking to all their manufacturers in Asia so they can get inventory information. Really early days, back in the mid-'80s, and working with GE Information Services to build that application to get more real-time data rather than relying on things like faxes and telexes. So we've been hooking systems together for a long time, and if you're old enough to even know what I'm talking about, yeah, you're a dinosaur, and join the club. We then got really busy during the 90s with the web, working on things like supply chain and order to cash, and really perfecting, in many ways, thinking that we were perfecting, kind of the real-time aspect of trading relationships. Billions of dollars spent on hooking our supply chains up with our partners, hooking ourselves up with customers, and so on. Really valuable work, and this is going to continue to go on for some time. We're going to continue to use the same exact technologies that will evolve, as time goes on, but they're not going to go away anytime soon. EDI is still very important. The exchanges that existed out in the mid-'90s and then into the 2000s will still exist. Really, what was happening in the last 10 years is, and this is should be old news to everyone on the call at this point, is consumerization of IT happened as a result of expectations. And we all started getting powerful computers in our pockets. We started using web services from places like Flickr or Gmail. Gmail I love because it's 2 gig of storage back in the day when we in IT used to basically put a cap of 250 meg or 500 meg on your Exchange mailbox. And if you think about that, and the expectations that are shifting is people are getting better technology outside of the enterprise back in the 2000s, and expectations really shifted. Salesforce comes along, teaches us that enterprise applications could safely be run in the cloud and add value. Mobile phone, the iPhone comes out, and change really starts to accelerate. Expectations about how we're consuming our lives are really starting to change. And for my money, it's more about the App Store than it is necessarily about the iPhone, but the beauty of the integrated experience where all of a sudden we as human beings are starting to expect that our digital lives, whether or not it's personal in our private lives or it's our work lives, our expectations are dramatically shifting to the way that we expect to consume that data, consume those transactions, interact with the various aspects of our life. same time, Twitter is reminding us all about the importance of platform and the importance of ecosystems. This was already well understood by the likes of eBay and Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and so on. Twitter's massive ramp in growth was really born because of the open nature of their platform strategy, which Eve rightly pointed out started to close up a little bit, but their basic domination was fueled because of the ecosystem strategy that they had, and they thought of themselves as a platform very much in those early days as well. So what does it all mean? I think everyone on this call will recognize that we just spend less time in front of our desktops. They're not going away. We still spend time in front of a browser, but in many ways, the old way of interneting made up word. So the old ways of interneting are shifting. Our expectations about where we're going to consume our digital lives have fundamentally shifted to the point where we expect our data wherever and whenever we want it. Again, it's personal life, personal digital life, whether it's your social networks or booking a restaurant or table at a restaurant, or it's your work life and getting access to your sales funnel, looking at bug defect reports, interacting with your suppliers. You just expect today that you're going to get this anywhere that you want to get it while you're on the road. So what do you do? And what is really exciting to us here at Mashery, and really kind of what is in our DNA and very topical for the conversation that we have today, is that the humble API kind of comes back front and center. If you think about what we are doing as IT professionals, it's not about repurposing websites, right? We don't go and do screen scraping and cram our experiences and give that to our customers or our partners or our customer end users. We're building apps. And in many ways, if you think about what we've done in the app economy and app development environment, you don't tend to cram your entire experience into the footprint of a mobile phone. You're not trying to put every experience that you have crammed into your HDTV screen footprint if you're building apps for the living room. You're basically building special purpose apps that grant wishes. And where do these come from? Coming back to our profession that we've all chosen, comes back to the APIs. The way that people are getting onto mobile devices, connected devices, is through this notion of APIs and API platforms as a strategy. So how do we get there? And what's really interesting to us is, if you think about your company as a platform, and for any computer scientist, you probably studied this in school, right? You think of an organization as just an object and a collection of things that it can do. You have product info, you have the services you offer, you have ways that you do business together, the way that you service your customers. These are all the assets, and these are all the services, web services, APIs, whatever you would like to call it, of your organization. Your partners, perhaps the public developer community, the person sitting in the cube next to you for internal projects, all want access to this. And if you think of the kinds of things that people are wanting to do in this space, whether it's you building a mobile application for your business, extending what your website does, exposing mobile versions of enterprise apps, or it's your strategic partners and getting more affiliates or distributors, or having your customers pull content from your enterprise systems to deploy within their web experience or within their applications, or if you have the dreams of getting after long tail business development opportunities, where you're looking for independent development houses or garage developers, all of these people want access to this information. You really can't go and build all of this yourself. There's just way too many projects that your average IT organization is going to be able to go off and do. So really the way that we think about this is, if you think of your business as a platform and you think of all of the places that you need to get your digital assets to tomorrow, it really comes down to this API management concept. So if you build an ability to expose in a way that your partners can easily get access to in an entitled fashion, great documentation, you think of your API platform from a business perspective, you have a way to go off and address this incredible opportunity that's in front of all of us. So this is really an evolution. If you think about SOA and what we've spent a lot of time with over the past couple of decades, you're really talking about point-to-point stuff, high security, not to say that APIs are insecure or unsecure, But this is about basically providing a platform that opens new opportunities. Your business people want them. Your job as an IT professional is to make sure that you are able to offer the API and the digital assets of your business to the different partners that you need to and that your business is demanding in a way that's secure but highly accessible and more accessible than it's been in the past. Leads to faster development. Lots and lots of partners is one thing that's very different about this space than traditionally what we've been spending time in with SOA, where you're talking about a few dozen to 100 partners. You're talking about API programs that we see, into the 20,000 developer partner kind of ranges for some of the more name brand customers that we run. It's about innovation and empowerment. And again, this isn't about necessarily things that the public community, developer community is doing. There's lots of examples where people are making APIs more accessible for employees, dealing with all the InfoSec and dealing with all the access and entitlement up front, great documentation, and giving the developer next to you and the cube next to you an opportunity to create something unique and innovative for your business. So, our role still as IT and integration professionals, we still are going to secure the API traffic. Just some new paradigms. Eve touched on some of them as well, and OAuth being an important aspect of how we're doing this. API keys and secrets as a design pattern that, for the most part, every API that's out there, certainly that's public, kind of follows that paradigm. OAuth is added as added in cases where there's end user authorization. You may be integrating your entitlement system on your back end. You're thinking about things like throttling and limiting, designed by or defined by type of trading partner, for example. And then as IT pros, you need visibility into the traffic patterns, so you can do things like revoke or block traffic that looks like it's not desired within your business. So the point is not to open up a back door. The point is to make this accessible, but do so in a secure and professional manner, so you can allow your business people to kind of do the things that they need to within a business development environment. This is a shot that I love from our friends at Cisco. This was a presentation that they did at an identity conference last summer. And really, if you kind of look at some best-in-class things that people are doing, is very much a partner open program where all of the Cisco partners can kind of come into their externalization platform, but it's fully integrated with their Ping Federate identity and access management system, as well as integrated with their entitlement system. So from a partner perspective, partners of theirs, developers that work for partners of theirs, walk up to their developer experience, and they're basically told what they have access to. It's not even a self-registration that you might have seen in many of the publicly available APIs that are out there. You're effectively told what you have access to based on who you are, with that integration with all the back-end entitlement systems that are out there. So some pretty interesting stuff that an organization the size of Cisco is doing. So once you've got all this put in place, you've got entitlements, you've got security put in place, you've basically produced the raw building blocks of having an externalization program. In many ways, our jobs as technology people is to get out of the way. And I love Eve's slide where she talked about the different kinds of actors that exist in this environment. It's so true. We're talking about something that is highly connected to the business. So get out of the way, right? You basically want to create an outstanding experience for the engineer sitting in the cube next to you, or the partner engineers, or perhaps the public independent developer community. Create a great developer experience that allows somebody to come in the middle of the night, get onboarded as appropriate, see documentation, play around with the tool. So if you provide an environment where developers can discover what's available on your platform, they can do that in a self-service way. There's great documentation tools like our IO Docs feature, or there's a number of open source options out there for creating interactive exploration tools for APIs. Have a great onboarding experience. So they can do these things when they want to. It could be in the middle of the night, could be over the weekend, could be during the day. They don't want to talk to you. They want to be able to get access in a way that you've kind of granted them. And then create great testing and collaboration tools. So, there's a community management aspect of this that's quite different than what we've been doing when it comes to SOA, which tends to be very, partner management oriented, point-to-point, traditional teams. The API management movement is quite different. This is about using social tools and community-led support and things of that nature. You know, as you've built these raw building blocks and you're thinking about exposing these things to the business, really what we talk a lot about is about the idea that your API assets are something to be packaged. You need to be thinking about your APIs as products. Business people, once you've exposed these APIs, will come up with new ways to address new market opportunities that they see if they're managing this program from a business perspective. So you really want to be thinking about the underlying digital assets as assets that you can regroup and package into brand new offerings. You kind of think about this a little bit. You can think of cell phone plans or cable plans. These are things that product organizations, marketing organizations think of all the time. Different prices for things, different things that you get based on package. It's no different in what's happening in the API community, where if you think about the different physical web services you might be exposing, business people will find new ways to kind of cut that information and call them something new. They might call them gold, silver, and bronze. They might call them public versus private. They may have different prices around them. But providing them an opportunity where you've created these secure physical web services, but giving them tools that allow them to dynamically create new ways to package it up and go to market is very compelling. So with that, I'd like to just talk a little bit about a use case of one of our customers, Coca-Cola Enterprises, and I love this because these are guys that, you know, specifically that team could have been the dinosaur team that I talked about in that first picture. This is a team that's been doing everything, you know, for in the integration category, from EDI up through SOAP web services, supply chain integration. And they had a unique event coming up last summer where they were really marketing heavily all around the Olympics. And what they needed a way to do is to build very quickly a mobile experience for 250 employees that were going to walk around the Olympic grounds and making sure that all of the refrigerators were stocked full of Coca-Cola products. They needed to get there very quickly. They had an existing infrastructure, and I love this because it shows the evolution of it. It shows the power of API management as an evolution of what we've all been working on in a way that we can augment what your already entrenched middleware is doing. So you have a situation where they have SAP on the back end and exposing all the BAPIs that SAP exposes, these web methods from middleware, and they expose an order API, SOAP API, and have for a long time in production with some of their partners. What they needed to do was to get a very lightweight RESTful version of that API exposed so they can build these unique experiences. So they did simple protocol translation, added Mashery's OAuth accelerator, very quickly built an iPad app that then their employees could actually take around and place orders directly into the SAP system as they walked around the Olympic grounds. So really compelling stuff, right? They were investing a massive amount of money in marketing. The business people wanted to make sure that there was never any kind of stocking issue. They needed a way to get there fast, and the way that they were able to do that was through the Humble API. Very quick. They threw away the app as soon as they were done because it was so simple to actually get it created. What's exciting for them is now they're doing internal hackathons. They're thinking about how do they take advantage of the fact that it's easier access to this data. It's still secure. It's still driven by entitlement. But they're able to unlock their engineers to come up with brand new ways to consume that same data. So very exciting story there at Coca-Cola Enterprise and what they're doing. So finally, and I'll leave some time here for questions, finally just what we do for a living is everything that we've talked about so far in this webinar is a product that we offer here at Mashery. So we offer our customers an out-of-the-box white label partner portal where you can get your own branded experience for running that developer partner experience, issuing keys, all the interactive documentation, reports for your partners, and the social aspects of forums and blogs. We manage all of the OAuth, the security, the access rights. We put set rate limits and throttles, give you tools to be able to shut developers down that you wish to, or give broader access rules to developers that you care about, bucket them into different kind of developer tiers. Uniquely as a SaaS company, we also offer effectively a content delivery network for cacheable data. You can do protocol translations on the fly, an out-of-the-box UI for packaging up that content that we talked about in packaging, where you can give tools to your business people so they can actually create new variations of the APIs that you've exposed in the Mashery platform. And then finally, very rich analytics that are business driven. So who's driving the most business value in your partner community? Who should you be engaging with from a business development opportunity? Yes, there's all kinds of sysadmins and ops eye candy in these reports, but it's also very much focused on API management and the business value aspect of it. This is all kind of wrapped up in a bow through a couple of service offerings that we offer as well. So if you need help in understanding where really what your strategy should be about API platforming, we have a team that can help you on that, as well as a team of evangelists that run a number of events for our customers to help market the API platforms that they're exposing into the community and find the right places to do so. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this morning's webinar. You and I both had a blast, and we'll open it, Bonnie, for questions.
Thanks, Chris and Eve. That was a lot of very valuable information. We'll now go into questions with the remaining time we have. Again, I'd like to reiterate that we'll be able to send out this recording of this webinar to all the attendees, so you guys will get a copy of the slides and the recording and all that. I know that was something we got a question about. So we have one question from an attendee. In order to utilize OAuth, is there a license you must acquire to apply to your app?
Is that one for me, do you think? I'll tackle that. OAuth is an open standard. It's actually one of the IETF RFC standards at this point. It has no licensing requirements to use the design of the security mechanism itself. Obviously, products that implement it and offer that in a kind of nicely productized form may very well charge you for that.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, so it's an open standard. You can just think of this as a security standard that exists, and scan Google for the OAuth, I think it's .net website. You can read all about it, and you can go to the IETF page to get the down and dirty specifics. You know, as a product company that offers this, it is just packaged as part of our core offering for customers that license the platform edition of Mashery.
Okay, and we have another question. Is Forrester saying that SAML is dead for single sign-on?
No, Forrester is not saying SAML is dead, and I can actually back that up. We actually published something we call a tech radar about identity standards pretty recently, and SAML was one of the 17 things that we looked at as an identity-related standard, and that included OAuth, it included LDAP and Kerberos, and a lot of things that were emerging and traditional. And it turns out that SAML is actually still growing in adoption, and the reason that it's not sort of gone into a more quiet period is precisely because of SaaS apps and SaaS APIs and the imperative for businesses to allow their employees to do outbound single sign-on to those SaaS apps. So there's quite a lot of adoption among those business SaaS companies and those business process outsourcing of SAML at this point. So it's not dying, it turns out. It doesn't do every job well, which is one of the reasons why the SAML to OAuth bridge is so interesting.
Okay, thanks, Eve. And we've got one last question. What are some techniques you'd suggest we use to convince our management to allow us to open web APIs?
Maybe I take a crack at that one first, Eve, and then would love to hear your thoughts as well. You know, I think broadly things are getting easier. I think, you know, in executive ranks that we talk to, you know, I think the executives are getting it. I think, you know, there's enough proof points out there that you can point to that really help you kind of make that business case. You know, I think one of the things that we've seen for a long time is that a lot of times in the executive suite, people think of web APIs as this backdoor security hole. And, you know, I think what we've tried to talk about in this conversation is that it's, you know, absolutely not that case, right? If you put the right tools in place and you're managing this from a very business-driven aspect, in many ways, you know, you're talking about IT becoming heroes, where you're offering business development opportunities while also making sure that you're minding the store. So, you know, I think a lot of it is just born in that idea that You don't know exactly what you're going to get out of it. It feels like it's insecure. So, I would just look at, talking about, the security aspects that we've talked about today, educating your management that it's not about just public developers. It's about getting closer to your customers, to your partners, and whatnot as well.
Yeah, and I would just comment a little bit to say, there's a couple different approaches you can take. We've got a sort of well-honed web services approach now that uses more traditional paradigms. It may make sense to convert some of those over, but what a lot of people are doing is putting shims on top for now while they consider their options. It doesn't mean throwing everything out, and in fact, the interfaces on top of interfaces thing, as long as you're looking after performance, can be a viable, I would say, near-term strategy.
All right, thank you, Chris and Eve, again. And for everyone on the line, thank you so much for attending our webinar. Again, everyone will receive a copy of the recorded webinar. And if you have any further questions, feel free to contact Chris or Eve, and you have their contact information. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the time.